Welcome to the Print Softcover, our digital platform for launching non-fiction books. Today we are joined by Pranay Kotasthane, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Missing in Action: Why You Should Care About Public Policy. Raghu Jetri is also the co-author of this book. It is a Penguin publication. Here's the book. Great. Pranay is Deputy Director at the Takshara Institution. Raghu Jetri is a public policy and political economy enthusiast. Missing in Action aims to bring a debate and discussion on public policy in India, and it also aims to make public policy available to a larger and wider audience and to bring discussion on the topic. As the writers state, we seldom pause to reflect on why the Indian state works the way it does. Missing in Action aims to change this via unpacking public policy concepts for the reader in simple understanding, using everyday experiences to illustrate this. And also, the book also explains the logic or the lack of the Indian state's actions, shortcomings, constraints, and workings with regard to public policy in India. So, Pranay, my first question is that could you just simply unpack the central argument of the book? And also, within that, since the book is divided into three main thematic sections, one dealing with Sarkar, Bazaar, and Samaj, could you give one finding from each as well?
Yeah. Hi, Suchet. Thanks so much for having me in this conversation. So yeah, actually there is not one central finding in the book, in the sense that there are many different strands that we pick up. But if I had to sort of compile all of that into one view, our aim here was to sort of tell people more about the fundamentals of public policy. So we are trying to address the other end of the policy pipeline. There are a lot of books which talk about how policy should be done with respect to the politicians or with respect to the bureaucrats. But there are very few books which talk about public policy from the other end, for common citizens. Why is the state the way it is? Why is it that the state is so powerful and yet sometimes it doesn't do what we want it to do? Why is it so well intentioned and yet is it weak? These are some paradoxes of the Indian state, and that is what we wanted to uncover and try to explain and put forward a theory of the Indian state, told in a way that anyone could understand. So we've taken examples from everyday life, we have taken examples, references of movies, etc., to try and explain the fact that we need to understand the Indian state much better. Generally, public policy is an area where everyone has a view, as it should in a democracy. But we also have very strong opinions, just like we have our own favorite cricketer or a favorite movie. We also have strong opinions about what the government should do, what it shouldn't do. It should ban things that I don't like.
If I can just break into there, I think those beliefs you put really well in the beginning in those 10 sort of misconceptions that you talk about.
Yes. So those are some 8 beliefs which we'd sort of written, and the idea was, what are some 8 things we should, the principle was that we should unlearn public policy before learning public policy, and we put down some sort of 8 common beliefs that we have. So if you want, I can discuss them. Yeah.
I think the one in them which I found most fascinating was that people, and which is so often heard, that policies are good but implementation is poor. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, this is something that we always hear, right? And the way I put it in Hindi is that niyat aur niti mein zameen asman ka farak hota hai. So the fact that you have good intentions is first of all no guarantee of good policy. And even if you have a policy which is great, and when the implementation goes bad, often you will see the people saying that no, policy was great but implementation was bad, and that's why things didn't go. But if you learn public policy, you will understand that one of the basic ideas of policies to take implementation into account. So we try to look at what are the unintended consequences. We try to anticipate them. We try to create a policy which will take into account the incentives of people, how they'll change, and hence mitigate some of the unintended consequences that might happen. But often it's something that we don't think commonly, and we are very easily able to say that the policy was great and implementation was bad. So what now we say is every good policy takes into account implementation. At best, you could say that, an idea was good, but if it were a good policy, it would have taken in details about implementation. It would have taken details about the capacity required to implement that and things like that. And these are things that anyone who's learned public policy would know. So that was one belief that we really wanted to tackle.
I think that's a very important point, that there's a difference between an idea and a policy. An idea could be a thought and basically the philosophical grounding for a policy, but the policy must include implementation and capacity, state capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you an example,
Yeah.
Suchit. So for example, nowadays there is a lot of talk about how there is rising inequality, and one way that people will jump at a solution because there's rising inequality, they'll say that you should have wealth taxes and you should tax the rich so that we will have more money for everyone to distribute. Now, this is a commonly said solution, idea, policy, but when it will be implemented, it's sure to go wrong because we've had wealth taxes in the past. And the results of wealth taxes are easy to anticipate, right? First of all, it is difficult to estimate what is wealth. People will change, put wealth in the names of their relatives. It's difficult to estimate the value of something like a land or a flat, etc. So people will change their assets into those kinds of commodities, or people will just take money out of India, and we've seen all these things happen. So people who say that, no, wealth taxes should be had, need to look at the implementation from what has happened in the past and try to understand that these kinds of policies actually have counterproductive consequences. And hence, we should be very, very cautious about putting forth very simple sounding solutions. So those are some of the things which illustrate the difference between policy and implementation.
I guess another point that is then that memory is quite short with public policy. As we talk about white tax, the debate, I guess, keeps going on every few decades, and people forget that it was quite a bad experiment, we should say. Yeah. But just to move forward, there is a chapter which talks about the state being omni-absent. So just to sort of contrast that, I'd want to ask, could you explain that to us? And in what way does the Indian state then get right about public policy, if anything?
Yeah. So the Indian state does get things right in the sense that we've progressed since where we were in 1947. So definitely there are many good things, and probably that will be there in our next book where we will discuss more about policy successes. But the broad idea that we wanted to emphasize on is how the Indian state is busy doing many things which it shouldn't be doing, and not doing the central things for which the Indian state exists. So that is why we call it is omni-absent, in the sense it is absent in the places where we want it to be. And examples of that are easy to look at. So Indian state is a very ambitious state. The Indian Republic also comes hard-coded with the social revolution algorithm. So it wants to do a lot of things, but the Indian state lacks capacity in the most basic things that we would want, right? So for instance, even though we feel that Indian state is actually overstaffed, Indian state isn't. We are, if you even compare with quote unquote capitalist state like the US, when you normalize our government employment size, Indian state is smaller compared to the US. So we have fewer people within the government. We also are, the Indian state is also underperforming on the core issues that we often discuss about, right? Provision of public goods, law and order, policing. These are judiciary. These are things which no other institution in the state society market framework can do. It's only the state which can actually function. And we see time and again that the Indian state is very weak in these core functions, and yet we as a citizenry want the Indian state to do everything else apart from these core functions, which no other institution can do. So that's the one of the main ideas that we also wanted to say, that the Indian state is omni-absent. Let us get the state to refocus on the core things which only it can do, and that's how we can move ahead.
So to take this forward, then I'd like to ask you, what exactly should this state be focusing on? And does that also imply that the state should be focusing less on running businesses and things like that?
Yeah, so states should definitely not run businesses, which is one major reason why our Indian state was omni-absent, because you would have seen that we still have nearly 1,500 government-run companies, and earlier we had many more companies starting from 1951. So the idea is we have limited state capacity. The thing that we need to understand is our state, even though it is ambitious, it has limited capacity in terms of the expenditure it does. It has limited capacity in terms of the capacity it has within the government. It also has limited capacity in terms of the number of people that it has. So given that it is a state which is weak in capacity, we must get the state to focus on the central things, which I just mentioned, which are law and order, judiciary, ensuring that people, the markets and the society can express themselves freely, right? So it is not about government running businesses. It would be about creating pro-market policies which allows business to function. So for instance, 1991 reforms was a great thing that the state was able to accomplish, right? It led to nearly 2.5 million people coming out of poverty every single year, and the state just did things which was to get away from running businesses, get away from overburdening regulations, and yet it was not that the state was completely out of the picture, right? It was trying to strengthen the regulatory aspects which are saner, which are not overburdening, and yet it allowed others in the market, others in the society to express themselves freely. So I think those are the kinds of things we want the state to do. Think of better regulations, think of how you can unleash the power of the market and the society to get great things done. And when markets go wrong, it's not as if markets are always going to be great. When markets and businesses go wrong, we need to have the capacity to bring them to justice. We need, and that's where our judiciary, our entire law and order system really needs an upgrade, right? We know that our policing system doesn't work, our judiciary is too slow, and these are the things that we really need a lot more focus on. In fact, it's only now that we are getting indices which show time and again that how under capacity exists in these domains. And I am hopeful that as we focus on these areas more and more, the citizenry will also start demanding that these are the areas that the state must get its act together on.
So as we were talking about markets, one of the chapters of the book also talks about markets, and it calls it India's mistrust with markets. Does this essentially mean a mistrust? And also you talk about pro-market policies, which you just mentioned as well. Could you talk about some of those as well?
Yeah. So yeah, the chapter, this is a section opener on markets. So we talk about the relationship between the state and markets. And our main assumption here is, again, like, we have these notions that US is a capitalist country, USSR is a socialist economy, but India is a mixed economy. So we can just pick and choose some of the best things that are there in both models, and somehow we'll get it right. But that's not how the reality is. So like people, for example, don't know that even in the US, nearly 40% of their entire GDP is spent by government. So it's not as if the US government is just it's a bad land where government has completely abdicated its responsibility and it's free for all. It's not that. It is the fact that the state does limited things, but it does those things very well. That is what the state does. For example, the expenditure in the US on healthcare, on education, on defense is very high. And these, you would argue, are one of the core responsibilities of the state. These are areas where we know there are market failures, and we would want the state to do various things in these areas, right? And yet, that's why we call it mistress, because this idea is that we have these notions, probably because of the colonial experience, etc., where markets got intertwined with exploitation, and we continue to have that framework even today. And we see businesses inherently with suspicion, the fact that there are things that are going to go wrong. And when we start with that notion, then we always end up having the state do things that it is not really good at, right? So we'll have state running businesses because we think businesses can't do it themselves. So that's what our idea was, that we need to change our mental model about the businesses itself. We need to regulate businesses well, but inherently we have to see businesses as solving our problem. So this is like a Jugalbandi between the state, market, and society. It's not necessarily a confrontation and a zero-sum game between them. And then you talked about pro-market policies, right? So
about which specific pro-market policies do we need for a more efficient system?
Correct. Yeah, so the greatest example of the pro-market reforms that we had was 1991 reform, one of the examples where we suddenly broke down a lot of barriers which were preventing Indian businesses from going ahead and from us keeping India poor, right? So that was the first step, right? So we had taxation reduction, we had reduction in the number of licenses. So license permit Raj in a way sort of came down. So that was one step. But now we need reforms 2.0. There are lots of other factor market reforms which economists talk about, land liberalization, liberalization of, for example, electricity, bringing electricity under GST or bringing petrol under GST are a pro-market reform which will positively impact everyone who participates in the market. It's not about picking up one particular sector or one particular business. These will positively impact everyone. Another example is just the trade reforms. So, for example, India still has very high import tariffs. In fact, they have increased in the last 4-5 years. And when import tariffs increase, one, the consumer pays for it. And second, because import tariffs are higher, since we operate in a global supply chain, the products that Indian companies make by importing from other places are not competitive in the international market at all. So again, if we were to lower the trade barriers that we have, this would be a pro-market reform which will positively impact all businesses across sectors in India.
Okay. So essentially, a lot of factor market reforms are needed. Tariff barriers need to go for us to have this reform 2.0. And you spoke about land liberalization. Could you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah. So again, there are various restrictions on transfer of land. In fact, that was also one of the main points about agricultural reforms as well, right? So there have been attempts to sort of reduce this, and as we know, any Indian knows, transferring land or dealing with land in any ways is a very cumbersome process. So improving the processes which help people transfer land to others will again unlock a lot of things, especially in the agricultural sector, which has been one of the reasons why that people are people want to exit agriculture, but they can't or they don't because there is this land which sort of is very difficult to manage. So now there are some states which are taking initiatives. Some states are making it easier for agricultural land to be converted into non-agricultural land, etc. But those are the kinds of things we want to do quickly at the national level, and that will help, as a definite pro-market reform, which helps everyone in the economy.
Okay. So another aspect of the book was that it also wants to increase the debate of public policy, make it more accessible, get more people thinking and talking about it. So how important do you feel this is, that to make public policy a notion of discussion with students, colleges, people in general? And why do you think the public so far, or the people in general, have been sort of out of the sphere of public policy making?
Yeah, that's the curious thing, right? Public policy has the word public in it, and yet the public is often missing in the conversations. So it's not as if people don't know. We all know. We have our notions about how the government should function, what the government should do. Often we don't think that there is a science or a logic behind what the government should do, right? Like, it often ends up being a partisan sniping contest that, this is the way government should do just because I feel it is. So we don't probably appreciate the fact that government as an institution, when it does something, there is coercion involved. When there is coercion involved, and there is an opportunity cost to everything that the government does, right? So when government uses 1 rupee money for something, that 1 rupee is not available for something else, right? So these are the kind of notions which probably are a bit counterintuitive and don't come to us naturally when we're having common sense arguments. So the idea is that we need to go beyond that and to be able to understand that better. So this has been one of the projects that I have been involved in through various ways. So we teach public policy at Takshashila institution where I work. So that is one way where we try to talk about public policy and its fundamentals better, so that we know the consequences of government actions better. I've been trying to do this in Hindi, Urdu as well, where we do podcasts to try and bring these issues to the fore. And the whole idea is, we think people should know about public policy fundamentals for 3 reasons. One, one reason is governments won't be able to take us for a ride, because it often happens governments can just say we are doing something because we have a great intention in mind. So we end up discussing intentions without discussing consequences, right? The classic example being demonetization. You can always say that there were good intentions. Governments largely never do things out of bad intentions. But even if we look at consequences, we know that there were a lot of problems with that policy, right? So idea is, if we know public policy fundamentals better, we'll be able to question the government better on the policies and the implementation and the objectives that they talk about. The second reason is, we'll be able to sharpen our demands better. Like I said, if we think government is the my baap, that government should solve every problem that I have. A classic example is, recently, I don't know if you saw, there is a lot of debate on we should have one charging port, a USB-C charging port, and government has brought in that policy. So again,
like the EU has made that standardized.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So I have written about that in the past as well. I mean, it's great to have only one charging port, but the question is, do you want the government to mandate that and bring that? There are consequences when government mandates something. When government says only USB-C is the charging technology. So what does it do to other charging technologies? What does it do to people getting locked with this USB-C technology, which 4 years down the line, there might be a better technology called USB-D or USB-E, right? So we need, at the surface level, it might sound great, but as you think through it, you will know that government action actually can have counterproductive results. So what you would think is, we'll sharpen our demands and get the state to focus on the things that we've discussed, right? Those are the things which only the state can. And the third reason is just that we'll have a better discourse. As I said, because we are so passionate about public policy, we often debates on policies end up being debates of the same type that is Rahul Dravid greater or Sachin Tendulkar greater, and these are there is no rationale on this. We have our preconceived notions and then we battle it out, but that's exactly not how discourse will improve. We need to think of policy consequences, not intentions, not people, but how certain policies have certain consequences. Try to anticipate them and try to discuss those in order to have more policies in the future.
So before we run out of time, a final question. How do you see this dynamic of Sarkar, Bazaar and Samaj going forward in the next decade, and where will our public policy landscape take us then?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. See, the way I would want to think of it is, if you see the state, market, society, and the individual at the center of this triangle, each of the state, market, and society have their own strengths and they have their own weaknesses, right? So, for example, the state is great at employing force, but the state is very poor at running businesses or controlling or unleashing the creativity of the people. Similarly, markets on the other hand are great at for individuals to express themselves, to create things, but also markets are oblivious to inequity, right? And finally, society is what gives us that sense of belonging. It gives us that sense that we are not just an individual, but we are more than ourselves. So there are weaknesses of each of this, right? The society can become majoritarian, whereas the state can become overbearing, and markets can sometimes lead to iniquitous outcomes. So idea is that we need to bring about a balance of these three, to use the strengths of each to get them to function on areas which are its strong wicket, right? So like we know, state needs to get law and order, judiciary, health, education. These are areas that we need the state to play a core role in. Whereas we can leave other things to the markets and to the society. So idea is that we have somewhat lost that balance. Pre-independence or even before that, the society was always a stronger element. That's what like Rabindranath Tagore, etc., write in their analysis about how the state was never the most central institution in a community, right? It was society, sometimes markets, and the state was this distant entity. But after independence, for various reasons, the state came to occupy this central role amongst this troika, and we started seeing state as something which is going to liberate us from many things. And we know because of that we have a state which is ambitious yet underperforming, and it is well intentioned yet weak. So now we want to return to a balance where we are able to think of an architecture in which we allow the markets and society to have their place, and restrict the state to doing the things which we really want it to do. So that's where I would hope that we move towards.
No, I think that's a very important point that you said. You need balance between all the three: state, society, and market, and all of them to perform on their strongest aspects and not focus on what are not their facets, essentially. And I think you used the term better Jugalbandi. I think you said that somewhere.
Yes.
I think that's precisely what's needed. So thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion. For all our viewers, here's the book again. And we hope that people can read it and think about its debates and discussions. And engage with the topic. Very important topic. So thank you so much for joining us at ThePrint, Pranay. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Suchit. Thank you.